Today on Radio Free History, we are going to continue our series on modern art. Nobody seems to agree on what exactly modern art is, but everybody seems to agree that it's ugly. How did art go from the Sistine Chapel to a banana being duct taped to a wall? Due to this episode running a little bit long, we're releasing it in 2 parts.
In a society that's not religious, art is extremely important because it's one of the few things, other than maybe nature, the birth of your kids, it's one of the few things that's accessible that will make you feel wonder. And we live in a world deprived of fucking wonder.
Yeah, our last episode, we took a deep dive into asking the question, why is modern art just so fucking hideous?
And the more I thought about it, the angrier I got.
Yeah.
That this is what we get for art. The other generations get the Sistine Chapel. Like, when I was young, the last time they let like actual musicians be the stars of pop music was like Kurt Cobain, and he died just as I transitioned into high school.
Yeah, and for those of you who are under the age of 30, that's when we had people named the Spice Girls and Britney Spears and boy bands.
Well, this whole pop move, and the whole thing was like Kurt Cobain, guys like that. These were actual screwed up people who had clawed their way up through local scenes. Kurt Cobain played at Lee's Palace at one point in Toronto, believe it or not. Nirvana played there in '89. Everybody hated them. They didn't get them at all. This like Seattle sound. But it was people who clawed their way up. Now it was these kids who'd been basically created in a lab to do this specific thing that is focus grouped well.
Yeah. And they didn't even play any instruments. It was all auto-tuned.
And it was auto-tuned dancing. It was just a lower level. The virtuosity was gone.
Yeah.
The creativity was gone in a big way. I mean, I guess, whatever. Like, there was some weird Swedish dude writing almost all these pop hits. I forget his name at the moment. But like some autistic Swedish guy in a bunker in Europe somewhere wrote basically all of the pop hits. Like there's these that would be an interesting podcast to do actually on these people who actually wrote these songs, because they're, The Dream, he wrote Single Ladies. It's called The Dream. That's the guy's name anyway. But the virtuosity was lost in a big way. And that, you don't get that sense of wonder.
Yep.
You don't get that sense of awe.
So last week we asked the question of why did this happen to the visual arts, and some things I use the term art very, very loosely for. We started our story by going 500 years back in time to the Renaissance, and we're going to continue that story today. But before we do that, we got some good feedback last week on starting out by roasting modern art, and we're going to do the same here.
I feel like we're those 2 old Muppets.
Yeah, Statler and Waldorf.
Or maybe 30-something Beavis and Butthead. I guess that's kind of like, going to the museum, anyway.
Well, same disclaimer as last week. Yes, you can listen to this on Spotify, but please watch this on YouTube. You're missing out if you don't see this.
You got to see it to believe it.
Some of these eyesores.
It's horrible. It's just a travesties. You should go to jail for some of this art.
Well, we set up a lineup of horrible artwork, but sometimes fortune just smiles upon you, because a few days ago, that piece of art that I'm sure you read about in the newspaper a couple of years ago, where the guy just duct taped a banana to a wall, that sold for $6.2 million.
Now, here's the best part. The guy gets it, and the banana rots.
Mm-hmm.
And they tell him, you got to replace the banana every 3 days. So this is a piece of art that literally makes you make it every 3 days. You have to be Mozart and make this happen.
Well, but this is the thing. I can duct tape a banana to my wall, and I don't have to spend $6.2 million up front.
Yeah, that's another thing. It's like, how the hell? How do you get $6.2 million and then not be able to understand that?
Well, maybe it's because we saw the ass end of the punk scene in the late 90s, early 2000s, but the DIY thing had its own charm to it.
Yeah. There's some local...
If you can't even DIY this...
Yeah. Yeah, that's really sad. That's one of the coolest things about art is it will inspire you to make art.
Yeah.
And just yeah, the sterility of a mind. It's gonna be like, oh, okay, let's buy this for a lot of money.
Before moving on, I just have to read this quote. It was bought by some Asian crypto billionaire, and he said the piece, quote, represents a cultural phenomenon that bridges the world of art, memes, and the cryptocurrency community.
Our brains are designed to be pattern seeking. And as a result, one of the kind of pitfalls of being human is you can read a lot into things that aren't there. Anybody who's seen a face in the clouds, anybody who's like, think about it, like two dots and a semicircle looks like a freaking smiling face to us. Like that, anyway. So you can read a lot into something, and this is an example of that.
Well, if you want a more honest quote about this piece of concept art, if you even I feel dirty even referring to it that way. Let's listen to an employee of Sotheby's Art House. How do you value what, for me at least, is one of the most brilliant ideas in the history of conceptual art? Said David Galprin, Sotheby's head of contemporary art for the Americas. And what better place to ask that question than in our sales room, where tonight the answer came in at a resounding $6.2 million.
This is like when they had to pretend pornography was art because of blasphemy, or not blasphemy, indecency laws.
Yeah.
It's like that kind of tap dance about like what's going on here.
Well, he's honest about the fact that it's just a way to write off $6.2 million of a tax loss.
Jesus Christ. Can you just burn a pile of money? Here's another thing you can do, people. You can give it to charity. For $6.2 million, you can establish a charitable foundation and take care of maybe a problem somewhere in this world. But no, you're going to buy a freaking banana.
And both Sotheby's Art House and any charitable organization is staffed by art history majors, so it's really going to the same place.
Yeah, that's fair.
Moving on to the actual terrible modern art.
Oh, okay. Please tell me that they project the art onto that screen.
No, no, they don't.
Of course not.
So, in our last episode, we took a look at the finalists for the 2024 Turner Prize in England. Such visionaries as the woman who threw a big doily on an old Ford from the 50s and said it represented the Sikh experience in Glasgow.
I would be really interested in the Sikh experience in Glasgow. You could make like a Romper Stomper style movie.
Yeah.
With a Sikh experience in Glasgow. That's a great story. It is not told by a doily on a car.
No.
It's not. Doesn't touch it.
So, in the interest of fairness, we're going to look at the opposite side of the Atlantic Ocean and look at contemporary art in the United States.
Oh, good, the Americans. This is great. We're gonna inject a lot of rationality, a lot of
Modesty,
moderation. Nothing will be taken to its absolute extreme. I'm sure.
So the Whitney Biennial. It's an art show at the Whitney Museum in New York City. And it's supposed to showcase not just modern art in America, but the current state of culture in America.
That is a huge claim to make.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to guess we're not going to see any meth towns in the Appalachians.
Nope.
We're not going to see any Rust Belt towns where the factories all left the meth epidemic behind.
No, we're not even going to see any art about the encampments that are popping up in every freaking city.
Which also have meth.
Yeah, also it's a meth. Yeah, it's a meth and fentanyl situation here.
Yeah. What do you think this installation represents?
The glass?
The glass.
It looks like I'm reminded of like a teenager trying to see what they can get away with.
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate.
This is like, what can I say is art and get them to put in a museum? And
I would say it's what can I get away with that's going to make my art teacher not fail me.
Yeah, that's another thing.
Let's read what is written about this on the Whitney Museum's official website, why don't we? This is done by a woman named Charisse Perlina Weston. In this installation, she has wedged large panes of smoked glass against the museum's walls to suggest a moment of pause before collapse, suspension, and heightened risk. A poet as well as a visual artist, or she's never had a real job, Weston draws on the blues tradition of using repetition to create or amplify meaning. So she's honest about the fact that she's lazy. Here, that takes the form of reuse, as Weston repurposes glass that she used in an exhibition at the Queen's Museum in 2022. So she's not even finding a new chunk of glass.
The theme of laziness. I'm gonna guess that this girl goes to internet forums where they talk about not having enough spoons to do things.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I'm betting that. That's my impression.
There, the installation of glass was deliberately obstructive, evoking the Stalin, not Joseph Stalin, Stall-hyphen-in.
Oh, you got me all excited. You.
Planned by the Brooklyn and Bronx branches of the Congress of Racial Equity Corps to protest the 1964 to 65 New York World's Fair.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this Congress of Racial Equity was white as milk on rice.
Well, wait. Though never executed, so it didn't even happen. They couldn't even...
This is a group that tried to plan a protest. That's who we're praising.
It would have staged a monumental traffic jam on the roads leading to Flushing Meadows.
Because, again, I never feel more sympathy towards a group than when they block the roads and prevent me from getting home after a long day. That's when you block the roads, guys. That's everyone's on your side. Everyone wants to know what's up. Traffic's so wonderful in cities that causing a major traffic issue is just so novel.
Well, it tells you how the people in 2024 who think they're avant-garde and progressive have no new ideas. Everything is just completely derivative of something that was done not just like 10 years ago, like 70 years ago.
And 70 years ago in like 2 cities.
Mm-hmm. Through this repetition, Weston explores what she calls tactics of black refusal, in deliberate contrast to the usual connotations of glass with transparency and access. She also plays with the idea of a work of art that may never be totally resolved, but instead evolves to create new meanings and evade structures of ownership. I can certainly tell you this was never completed.
Yeah,
that I agree with.
That's the theme of this art, is lazy, incomplete, couldn't follow through, and it's in tribute to a group of people that failed to plan a protest. Or planned it, but couldn't get it off the ground. This would have been a great idea had they done it. So it's like, I guess it's fitting for the millennial, I guess the Zoomers or whatever.
Yeah, this was a millennial. She was born in 1988.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's like, that lack of follow-through. That's why we all have ADHD diagnoses.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of lack of follow-through, I guarantee she was labeled gifted when she was a kid and has felt like a disappointment her whole life.
We need to do an episode on the whole gifted thing, why it happened, what it did to the kids. That would be interesting.
Is there any white middle-class kid who was not labeled gifted in like 1995?
Nope.
No, there wasn't. All right. Let's move on to the next piece of modern art. See if we can find more of meaning in something.
They took us all, the gifted kids in my elementary school, and they congregated us once a week. They just put us in took us out of class for half a day and put us in a freaking portable somewhere, busted us to this portable, and just said, hey, you guys are all... It's just a bunch of autistic kids. Man.
And I bet you a teacher just felt just so self-satisfied for taking care of these kids with special needs.
Well, I guess. It was under the same, because again, it was all special ed.
Yeah.
So literally it was the same people who were dealing with the very, very special kids who were dealing with the quote-unquote gifted kids. It had been just globbed on. So we don't develop our talent. We really don't.
Speaking of not developing talent, what do you think of this piece of art on the screen?
If this was a corporate logo, I would call it lazy, derivative, not novel enough to ever stand out in anyone's mind, even if repetition was done millions of times on various products.
Yeah, I can see that. It kind of looks like a little bit of a letter S. Kind of. Let's see what this is. Let's see what this work is. Done by somebody named Torquays Dyson, who goes by she/her pronouns, because of course.
Good for her.
Described by Dyson as a monastic playground. All right, so that's already right out of the bat, right off the bat,
So
really, really
a
pretentious.
monastery? This is monastery? There's a monastic playground. It's called a monastery.
Yeah.
That's where they go.
Yeah.
That's where they cloister.
This installation is meant to be activated by visitors who are invited to touch, sit on, and experience the work in a tactile way. That looks like it's a big chunk of rock right there.
I love that you could never actually put this in a real city these days because the homeless, like,
Yeah.
fentanyl
Oh, it
addicts
would be
all over
vandalized.
it.
Yeah.
It would be vandalized, and people would be camping around it, and just fucking, like, there'd be so many zombies that it would have to be removed, or they have to put spikes on it.
Yeah.
So that's what I like. It's like, doesn't work on any level at all.
This prompt speaks to Dyson's conviction that liberation can be found at every register of movement. Freedom is an ongoing spatial question of motion and imagination. Dyson composes geometries on an architectural scale using light and space as formal building. That doesn't make any sense.
We're just word salad at this
Everything is geometry.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah, that's fair.
like, unless you're like an amoeba, everything is geometry.
Even I'm sure you
Yeah.
can. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. This is
You
just
can- yeah, you can-
words getting thrown out. Like, you remember you were telling me that one time somebody tried to use the term orthogonal,
Yes,
and you had to explain to them that they didn't know what that meant?
yes.
And yeah.
Draw any two variables on a graph. They're orthogonal to each other. Graph paper is right angles.
Yep.
Everything is orthogonal to everything else if you draw it on a graph.
So they've said nothing. Congratulations. Done.
Dyson, together the monumental arcs, implied gestures, and surrounding natural light articulate changing abstract shapes over the course of each day and night. It casts shadows.
Yep.
She figured out that a big chunk of whatever the fuck this is casts shadows.
Freaking cavemen probably figured out sundials and shit. Like, god damn.
For Dyson, the intertwining abstraction and blackness intertwine.
I would be so offended if I were a black person in this. Because again,
Oh.
back to the point. So all this black money in Harlem, they produce really pretentious, spoiled kids.
Yeah. Oh, and one of them made this, I guarantee
And
it.
these kids tend to try, for among the ruling class and in the artistic circles and stuff,
Yeah.
these are the kids that are the face of the black community.
Yeah.
Which is not, if
Okay.
you're talking about ghettoized people, it's like passing me off.
Yeah, it's one of two things. Either she's a spoiled black girl who had really, really rich parents, or she had a rich white mother and a black dad who she never met.
Some of the most spoiled people, clients I ever dealt with were, I get it, because let's say you work hard, you build a business, you want to give your kids everything. But like black parents who have money, they seem to really overdo that. And you end up with
Will Smith?
you end up with a very entitled group of people, and it's just because again, it's a weird phenomenon, right? Anyway, that doesn't transcend necessarily to the ghettoized community of this. That's a whole other thing. But definitely the middle class and the upper class groups, they seem to produce more pretentious, more spoiled kids than the other groups that occupy that. And think about the other groups that occupy that niche. It's a strong field.
For Dyson, the intertwining of abstraction and blackness is a central philosophical concern that came out of an interest in public infrastructure. Okay, so she went to grad school and had her ass kissed because she was black.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of pressure to keep, because they want high numbers of minority students, so they can say they have high numbers of minority students. So there's a lot of bending over for, people get, through programs, and it's not always good for everybody.
The relationships between ecology, belonging, and personal history, always personal history, take on new meaning with the terrace view of the Hudson River and the museum's location in one of New York's most vulnerable floods. So yeah, they had to put this on the roof of a building, and they somehow managed to turn that into a pretentious concept. That's enough of this bullshit. Let's look at the next piece. Why don't we?
I'm reminded of a kid who has to write 1,000-word essay, so they're padding their essay.
Yeah.
That's what I'm reminded. It's like, I got to get to 1,000 words. That's what that sounds like to me.
What do you think this is?
Oh God, tell me this is an advertisement that they're going to put
I know. Well,
in a bathroom somewhere. In a
again,
bar.
these people think they're avant-garde. This is just like a neon sign that you would have seen outside a disco in 1975.
Yeah, this was like all of Yonge Street and Church Street in the fucking 80s. Like all neon signs and shit.
So let's read about this installation, why don't we? It's by Damien Dinayazi, goes by they them pronouns. I looked this up. It's just it's a native who's gay. He's gay, but he didn't have the personality to make it in musical theater, so he goes by they them pronouns. That's what this artist is.
It's okay. That's
There's only about like 4 archetypes of non-binary people.
I've noticed that it's about 80% women,
Yeah.
which is strange.
Well, just being bisexual is no longer cool for teenagers, so they're all trans and non-binary now.
Well, the most strange thing to me is I know gays of every political leaning and every race and creed imaginable. I know like straight up transsexuals, like old school gender dysphoria transsexuals of every race and creed. Whatever's going on there, it's universal. If you're non-binary, I know exactly your politics.
I know exactly your haircut.
I know exactly. Yeah, and I've got a pretty good guess. You probably grew up with money. You probably went to had university education. It's a weirdly narrow set. You don't see the diversity with this. Anyway.
So, as a poet and activist, Damien Dinayazi has thought about how to use a colonizer's language against colonialism, noting that they, and this is they, the personal pronoun, want to, quote, see more poetry at protests, because slam poetry is not protest enough, right?
Talk about being freaking stuck in the 60s.
Yeah.
Like, we live in an age where you can shitpost a guy into the presidency.
Well,
and these people are still standing on the street in the cold.
This looks like a Twitter post. It looks like it's about 140 characters.
And I can pull my phone out and do a Twitter post, and many, many, many more people are going to see it than ever see this piece of art. It's just the saddest thing. You know, it would be like, you know, in the days of the pamphleteers, you know, somebody sticking to like, no, we're not going to use a printing press. We're gonna get our message out with scribes.
Here, their work is intentionally telegraphic. I'm saying his work. I don't care if I'm misgendering. I can't say that. It just doesn't. Am I talking about multiple people? Am I talking about one person?
This is confusing.
Here, his work is intentionally telegraphic, hung by the window so that it is visible from inside the museum and out, and mounted on the frameworks that suggest protest signs. Yeah, you're right. You called it. It's just in a 60s LARP.
It's again because these kids, they don't have religion by and large. So the protest is like their, you know, it's their revival. It's all these people together chanting, freaking out. Like it's this. Humans have a need to do that. Some people go to the club.
Yeah.
Some people go, you know, find other outlets for it. But this is just these kids get drawn into these protest movements. I was walking home today and I saw a guy with a sign running around as part of this protest that was blocking my way home. He's got this, you know, specific, you know, issue will free us all. And I was like, that's Jesus. So Jesus?
Well, that's not even the 60s. That's like the millenarian movement from the mid 1800s.
Yeah, lest we forget who inspired the hippies, right? A bunch of freaking Armenians, but not like Armenian, like in the sense of the Christian Armenianism.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So we've seen 2 art installations that basically look like if they were found at the landfill that represented blackness. We've had like Twitter using neon signs that's supposed to represent indigenous anti-colonialism. Let's take a look at what else the Whitney Biennial has on the docket. So what do you think this is?
Okay, this is the showroom of a like linoleum or vinyl sales company. So look at the showroom of a very boring company staffed by a bunch of Willy Lomans who hate their life. And I am in there trying to get a better deal on linoleum. And I also hate my life too at that moment.
Yes, not a bad guess. So this is done by actually a local talent, a chick from Toronto called Lotus L. Kang.
You're going to notice there's an archetypal Toronto female. It's a big red, Anita Sarkeesian, Ramona Flowers. It's apparently this goes back a ways in Toronto. It's kind of like the feminist bent, but yeah, I don't know. We don't. That's who represents Toronto women on the stage.
Well, I watched an interview with this chick. She is like she's an Asian girl, and she just talks in a growl.
Oh,
She's that type.
I know what happened. So basically, by and large, the Asian immigrants in Toronto and around Toronto are like, it's not like Ching Chong the rice farmer from the village. This is like freaking middle class people who came here to start a business, and they had no problem working 15-hour days. And they have this thing, it's called being a tiger parent. And that's like where you are just so brutal and exacting and demanding of your children that they can't possibly fuck up. And they're going to be. It's one of the reasons so many of these people produce doctors and lawyers, and
Every once in a while, one of them snaps and pays some colorful people to kill her family.
Oh, that's a great story. That was near where my wife's parents live, where that happened. That was. If you guys want to Google Jessica Lang, there's speaking of women being represented from the GTA, she had a pair of tiger parents, and she got tired of having tiger parents, so she had her boyfriend hire some thug dudes from probably Brampton to go kill them and fake a home invasion. And there's a great video. What's the guy's name? He does Jim Can't Swim, JCS. He did a great video on it. If you guys want to watch a 2-hour documentary on this woman and how they caught her and what her parents did to her, that'll explain where this is.
She has the same demeanor as the artist who did this work. I just want to say that.
Oh yeah, this is another one with like a deadpan. Oh god.
Yeah. So, Lotus L. Kang's In Cascades welcomes viewers into a world situated between inside and outside, life and regeneration, emptiness and fullness.
Some of those things aren't opposites. Life and regeneration? What the hell?
Suggesting a constant state of transformation. It consists of photographic films unfurling from steel joists suspended from the ceiling. The materials are industrial, portable, modular, and open to change. Kang exposes the film, an inherently vulnerable material, to varying conditions of light in multiple locations. So she just exposed film to two different. They're just film that's being exposed to different amounts.
I'm gonna go out on a limb. I'm gonna promise you that her parents have a showroom like this as part of the business they run.
Yeah. Oh, also she was trying to be a photographer as a kid. She overexposed the film once, and her tiger parents came in and said, "Lotus, you know how expensive film is?"
And she had to, on the spot, be like, no, I'm making art with the film, Dad. It's art. I overexposed it, but it's art. Look, see? Oh, okay, you're lucky this time.
She refers to this process as tanning, likening the film surface to skin and bringing the material back to ideas of the body, particularly its permeable relationship with environments. This is a girl who wasn't allowed to have a tattoo as a kid. That's what that tells me. By doing this, the artist hints at an unfixed understanding of one's body, diasporic identity, and the processes of memory.
Oh my god. That's kind of the new buzzword, diaspora.
Yeah.
For anybody who doesn't know, diaspora is like the groups of people that spread out. Usually you're talking about the Jewish diaspora. That's typically how the context I hear it in. But yeah, any group of people can have a diaspora.
I mean, I'm technically Scottish diaspora. I call myself that.
I'm so many diasporas. It's embarrassing, but.
So yeah, that's our local representation at the Whitney Biennial Art Show. But no contemporary art show in the year of our Lord 2024 would be complete without queer black people.
Oh God.
Now.
Talk about a challenging group to work with. Oh.
Now, I was expecting there to be one art installation featuring queer black people. There was like 8 of them, and they're not like pieces of art. They're all films about like queer black romances or a black guy going through a sex change operation or whatever.
If you want to be in touch with urban black culture, you're going to have to go on some very obscure SoundCloud thing, because it's their buddies, it's their cousins, frickin' rap group, it's their buddies. It's a very DIY culture in a lot of ways, and then in art you see that still to this day, a lot of that. So it's weird that these people kind of are trying to claim to be the ones to express that experience, and it's also weird that it's so gay. That's a very they're very religious, conservative people by and large.
Again, like I said, it's not just like there's one of these pretentious art installations. There was like 8 or 9 of them, and like, I guess think about it. In the 70s, you didn't just have Shaft, you had the entire blaxploitation genre. In the 90s, you didn't just have the Cosby Show. You had the Cosby Show and Family Matters and the Fresh Prince and Hang with Mr. Cooper and a whole bunch of these saccharine sitcoms. So now, like, black gays are in fashion, so it can't just be one of them. You have to fill out the entire museum with one after another of these people. And it got me thinking. There is a tradition in our culture of castrating people for the sake of entertaining society's upper class.
Yeah, that's near and dear to my heart. This is, again, I said this on the other podcast, but like every voice coach, every choir teacher that I ever had at some point told me that, oh, you would have been castrated to preserve your voice. 100%, no doubt. And some of them kind of said it longingly. Mm-hmm. Like, oh man, we could have preserved that voice.
Oh.
Like, it's just emasculating people for art.
I'm sure somebody who sits on the board of the Whitney Art Museum just feels like, oh God, we managed to castrate one of these black specimens.
Well, it comes down to, like, I think of fetishization. Like, I noticed I did a lot of bar mitzvahs in Toronto. I did security. I worked extensively with the Jewish community, who require a lot of security for various reasons. They would. The kids loved these bar mitzvahs. The black dancers. They always had a troupe of black dancers, kind of entertaining. At these things. There was
Mr. Bojangles.
It was a fascination. It was just with basketball. They all love basketball. They all love hip hop. There is a fascination among Jewish people and the upper class towards blacks for some reason. This is, again, I think, an expression of the fetishization more than anything else.
They see them as pets, and what did Bob Barker say at the end of every episode of The Price is Right? Have your pets spayed or neutered.
And it's the ultimate way to degrade some. Like, you're taking their culture, which is a very masculine, conservative, religious culture. That, by and large, American blacks, they're conservatives, and you're kind of dressing it up and representing it as that. It's just very strange. And it's not going to win you any points among that community. If you're wondering why maybe Trump's making some inroads, this maybe could explain it.
If there's one story about some black gays somewhere in the art museum, maybe there is maybe it can be the focal point, maybe it can make a point, but when there's 8 of them completely flooding the entire art scene, like, none of these have any novelty as one of 8 of these.
And then you end up with the black Hebrew Israelites being like, this is buck breaking.
This is totally buck breaking. This is exactly what this is.
You can't lob softballs to these people. You can't. You can't lob softballs to troublemakers like that.
It's of questionable historicity as to whether buck breaking actually happened down on the plantations in Alabama. This is totally buck breaking.
Yeah, it's fair. But there's just this fetishization, and it comes out in ways that, like, these are the people who would claim to be against fetishization. These are the people who would claim to be against, like, these, playing dolls with, this to me, it, reads like racial fan fiction.
Yeah.
I bet you if I open this up, it'll be upper class people, upper middle class people at best, writing what they think, stories that they think black gay people would do. It's like.
Or black transsexuals.
Yeah, tell me about it. I've known some black transsexuals. Would be very interesting to hear their stories, but it ain't this.
In our last episode, we made a couple of observations, and one of the central observations is we haven't really defined what the word art means. Because there's no agreed upon definition, it's a lot easier for these charlatans, whether it be art critics, whether it be art collectors, whether it be museum curators, to tell us that this ugly garbage truly is art and we don't understand it.
I found I don't have any answers in terms of what art is, but I think I found a sneaky way out of the question. if anyone ever corners you. You say art, because even Cro-Magnon man or whoever was drawing on cave walls and had art. Pre-humans seem to have had some kind of artistic outlet. We find freaking, bone flutes in Neanderthal hollows. This is something that goes back arguably to before we had language to describe it.
Well, you mentioned language. One of the things we went over in the last episode is that even in the age of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, these people were not called artists. They were called sculptors, they were called painters, they were called craftsmen. There were a lot of words that were used to describe them. The word art still existed, but it was used in the sense of, artisanal.
Yeah, like the guy who makes the cheese is art.
Yeah.
Goods.
That's what the word art would have meant back then. And Michelangelo would have been one form of an artist, but the idea that art is used to refer to a couple of activities, specifically painting and sculpture and architecture and a couple of others. This idea would not have existed during the Renaissance. However, we looked at Giorgio Vasari. Who was Vasari? He was the guy who, toward the end of the period now known as the Renaissance, he had done one retrospective. He talked about all of these painters throughout the last couple hundred years, culminating in Michelangelo and Raphael and Leonardo. And even though he would not have used the word art, whatever the concept of art we now have is, it was clearly what he was writing about here, even if he didn't use that word.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that this is such a young. When I think about art, I think about something primordial. And it's very interesting to me that this is something that just some dude with essentially a history podcast had. It was just an idea he came up with, uniting all of these different forms of art into something overarching that we can't really even define.
Yeah. Well, and again, it would be fine if we just say, okay, whatever Michelangelo did was art, even though we didn't have the word until after the fact. But it seems suspect that some of the horrible modern art we looked at in the previous episode and in this episode, the same word is supposed to cover that and supposed to cover the Sistine Chapel and supposed to cover Rembrandt and Monet and all of these things. It's just not clear at all that this is the same concept.
That tent is too freaking big.
Yeah.
And it's time maybe that we evaluated who deserves to be sheltered from the rain and who doesn't.
Yeah. So again, we ended our last episode by looking at Vasari's magnum opus, which was called it's anachronistically called The Lives of Artists. If you actually look at the actual title of it, it was The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. But the book is now referred to as The Lives of Artists. But again, that's somewhat anachronistically. That is put on it after the fact.
Okay.
But this is the first example of what we now call art. It's about painting and sculpture and architecture, but it describes it in such a way that it also includes some sort of higher level thought. It's painting and sculpture in the service of the church, and it's painting and sculpture in a very technical way that's supposed to express higher ideas. So that gives us our first hint towards what art is supposed to be, but I still don't think we've truly nailed it down yet.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I cannot come up with a definition of art that's consistent and that says what that would encompass everything I consider to be art in a fair way.
So let's continue on our historical story. After Vasari has written this book toward the end of his life, another one of the Medicis, this is a name we've spoken about in previous episodes. The name is all over the place when you look at the Renaissance. Cosimo de' Medici. He endows an organization called the Accademia e Compagnia dell'Arte del Disegno, the Academy of the Design Arts. And again, this word arts is no different than any other sort of artisanal activity.
Could sub in trade.
Yeah, exactly.
This is like a technical school almost.
It's essentially a guild.
Okay.
It's like any other trade union back in the day. You know, there would have been a guild of, I don't know, pottery makers, and the pottery makers would have pooled all of their assets and their money to make big purchases, but they also would have had a council of experts that would have said, you know, what is the correct way to make pottery. It's the Academy of Arts that Vasari was put in charge of. It's the same sort of thing. It was a trade guild,
Okay.
but it was the first group of people who were not just doing painting and sculpture. They had the market cornered on defining what painting and sculpture was supposed to be.
Okay.
Now, we still need to get to the time when artists are viewed as doing something higher than just being tradesmen with a messy workshop and a bunch of rich patrons who they whore themselves out to.
Yeah, these are the artists that I know and love.
Yeah. Now, the word beaux-arts, or fine arts, this appears in the 1600s in France. Then the word fine arts appears in England in the 1740s. And we will take a look at that shortly. But before I do that, I'm going to go over something interesting. I'm going to take a bit of a side jaunt. Let's look at music.
Ooh, I love music. This is great.
This is a timeline of famous composers and music. I'm not really cherry picking all that much. I just did the Google search for famous composers, found the most famous 20 or 25 or so, color coded them by nationality, and put them in this chart. I wasn't trying to skew it or bias it one way or the other. I mean, these names: Pachelbel, Vivaldi, Bach, Handel, Haydn, Salieri, Mozart. These are the greatest hits of classical music. I don't think I'm trying to cherry pick or leave anybody out here. If you want to get on Jeopardy and you need to study a list of famous composers, if you know everybody on this list, you'll be fine. But I've noticed something after doing this and color coding it. The orange composers, these are the French composers. Now, I associate France with being a place that produced a lot of classical music and a lot of culture.
Yeah, you think of the French, you think of high art.
All of the orange bars in this chart, they seem to be skewed pretty far to the right here.
Yeah, late comes to the party.
Exactly. That's not something I was expecting.
Ooh, a lot of Germans on this list.
Yeah. Well, again, this is musicians, but yeah, you'll notice. But there's a lot of Germans and Austrians, but they're kind of skewed to the left of here. For the first couple hundred years, all of the famous artists are German or Austrian or Polish. You got Pachelbel, you got Mozart, you got Haydn, you got Handel, a couple of Italians in there, Vivaldi and Salieri.
If you think that these are just names and they have no effect, you have heard Pachelbel's canon over and over again in different forms your entire life.
Yep.
There, right, that if you like Green Day, they have a whole song that's based on that. Vitamin C did a version of it, basically about graduating. If you've been to a wedding, you've heard it.
Yep.
That's how deep this goes in terms of roots of our culture.
Yep. But the interesting thing about the French composers is that they don't appear here until, what we start thinking of as almost modern music. Like Debussy, he's certainly considered a modern composer. He doesn't become famous until like the 1890s, which was the blink of an eye ago in the historical sense. And he's one of the earlier ones on this, like Ravel's Bolero. I guess Camille Saint-Saëns, he's a little bit earlier than that. He's not that much earlier, though.
What were the French doing?
Well, that's a good question. That's a very good question to look at. I cannot think of any famous French composers, at least not to the level of these names, who are any earlier than this. And this is the late 1800s that these people are all coming on the scene. So that begs the question, was it like that for painting as well?
That would be interesting to see if there's a correlation there. the same kind of pattern.
So again, I just did a Google search for French painters, and just look at all the dates here. There's a few exceptions to the rule, but Cézanne, late. Well, sorry, what was it?
Buddy in the bottom right corner, Nicolas Puccini.
But I mean, he's like the number 15 on the list here.
Right on it.
Cézanne, late 1800s. Monet, late 1800s. Renoir, late 1800s. Matisse, early 1900s. Degas, late 1800s. Manet, mid to late 1800s. Seurat, late 1800s. Gauguin, late 1800s. Delacroix, he's the Delacroix. Sorry, it's sorry to any French people who are listening.
Canadians have a version of white guilt based on not being able to speak French well enough.
Yeah.
So if you'll excuse us, it's just a cultural eccentricity that we have, having been raised to try to speak a very, very terrible dialect of French.
Yeah.
That no one else can understand in the Francosphere.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So just going back to the list of artists, Delacroix, he was mid 1800s. He was a little earlier than the rest of them on this list, but not that much earlier. And still, the mid 1800s isn't that far ago.
Yep.
Courbet, also mid 1800s. Pissarro, late 1800s. Toulouse-Lautrec, late 1800s. Braque, early 1900s. David, he's a little earlier. He's the late 1700s, and Poussin, he's far into that. But
what the hell was going on? Other than losing wars with Germany, what the hell was going on?
Well, that's this gives us a hint, because again, if you want to go on Jeopardy and you need to study your artists, if you know everybody on this list, you'll answer like 90% of the questions that get asked on Jeopardy. But they're not. Again, France had its painters. I'm not saying they didn't. I'm just saying they stayed culturally relevant within France, but they're not viewed as culturally relevant on the world scale.
I think maybe it was like the blues movement. The Kaiser kicked my butt. The Kaiser kicked my butt.
You're joking. You're actually spoiling a bit later on. You're actually not that far off with that.
Human nature, people.
Yeah. We will be bringing up the Franco-Prussian War as part of this story. I wasn't expecting to say it this early, but you guessed it right.
Mark is putting his stamp on this one.
Yeah. No, there's most of the people on this list became famous right after the Franco-Prussian War, and that is not a coincidence. But we'll leave that for now. But, I did realize looking at this, when people talk about New York City, they're not talking about all of New York City. They're not talking about Staten Island. They're talking about a few blocks in the middle of Manhattan, or like near the Broadway theaters and Times Square.
Yeah, and a small portion of Brooklyn that's just across the river.
Yeah. When they talk about the Dutch, they talk about windmills and clogs, which is just one tiny little region of the Netherlands. When people talk about art, we haven't really pinned it down, but it's amazing how much of that refers to this one very specific period from about the mid-1800s to about 1970.
It's weird. It's funny that I guess was this the time when we were getting kind of a international culture forming? Is that simple?
I park that for a bit, because I mean there was world trade going on. The age of sail was the 1500s, 1600s. There was global international trade up to that point. Cultures were, in full contact with each other, and at least somewhat modern cultures were in contact with each other. So I don't know if that's
And the ruling class all spoke Latin, so the ruling class could all talk to each other, and the academics could all talk to each other, and I assume these musicians could all talk to each other.
Well, and again, I'm not, obviously during the 1800s trade increased, so I'm sure that had part of it, but I don't think that's the catalyst for things.
Okay.
But we'll park that for a second. We'll take a deeper dive into it. But the really important thing to notice is just how much of what we call art, especially when it comes to France, and we consider France a fairly cultured country.
Oh, very, yeah.
Just how much of French art and music and other creative endeavors really comes from the 19th century and the second half of the 19th century. Not exclusively, but a lot of it.
Weird that you know that drops off in the
Well,
early first next century. You just don't see the same cultural influence from France. It's weird.
now, again, just looking at that timeline and looking at this list of French artists, this gives us one clue. I'm actually going to give you another clue that might surprise you, even though you almost certainly know about it. It was a movie from 1986 that almost everybody in our generation has watched, and it contains a very famous scene in an art gallery. The movie I'm talking about is Ferris Bueller. Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Bueller.
Yeah, that's the one. Now, I wish I could show you the scene without getting a copyright strike. I can't do that, so I'm going to have to show you some stills from the movie.
He goes into the art gallery, and he's just blown away.
Well, him and his two friends, yeah.
Him and his two friends. They're just enriched by these paintings.
But I'm going to show you some stills from that movie, from this scene.
Okay, the lady's coughing after church. I don't know what that.
Well, I mean, just look at this. This is Paul Gauguin. He's one of the artists on the previous list. It's maybe not the most realistic piece of art, but this is fairly representative of the artwork shown in the movie. This is also by Paul Gauguin. This is something he painted when he was in Tahiti.
This looks like a young adult fantasy novel, like a dungeon crawl for young adults. Like this looks like the top of that one.
Well, just say one thing about Paul Gauguin when he decided to visit the South Pacific. There were no age of consent laws in the South Pacific. Anyways.
Why would that have been so important to him, I wonder? Nah, who knows?
This is Edward Hopper's The Nighthawks, a very famous painting.
I like this one, and I think that tells you a lot about me, eating in freaking diners late at night.
Yeah. But again, it's not the same as what you would have seen on the inside of a church in the Renaissance. It's not some big epic painting showing some Greek or Roman scene from mythology. It's not painting a Bible story. It's not painting something out of literature. It's very modern in what it looks like.
Urns, but you know what I like most about this picture is there's no homeless guy.
Yeah.
In the coffee shop, banging on the window and having a tantrum. So this is nice. This is very peaceful. It did seem to me. Okay, this I don't like as much.
Yeah, this is Vasily Kandinsky. He's again early 20th century.
I'm feeling like his kid maybe did this.
We're actually not going to get as far as Kandinsky in this episode, but we will be talking about him in the next episode. Yeah, he was one of the first real famous artists to say, you know what, my art doesn't need to look like anything.
It's what are you getting across here? It looks like a frog getting exploded. What am I supposed to take from this? What does this say about our culture? What is this freaking expressing to future generations about the time we live in? It's just colors. It's just like...
Yeah, this is another Kandinsky one. Let's see what else is in the fair. Again, all of these paintings are seen in that art gallery scene from Ferris Bueller. These are all part of the collection at the Art Institute of Chicago. Here's a Picasso one you may have seen.
Yeah, this looks like really upsetting deviant art stuff.
Yeah.
Like this is like the kind of thing you'd see if you were digging around in the 2000s on deviant art. Some weirdo had this as a profile.
Yeah. This is, again, like I said, we're going to talk about Kandinsky in the next episode. We are certainly going to talk about Picasso in the next episode and go back to the question, like, is this art? Every cultured person in the 20th century, can't bend over fast enough to talk about what a genius Picasso was. Do you think this is the work of a genius? I don't know.
It's not something I'd hang on my wall, that's for sure.
I can't even remember who this one is by.
Something in the eyes here. It's not as lazy.
I think this is by Matisse. I might be wrong on that.
It's not lazy like some of the other ones. This looks like that kind of... What I take from this is my very generous appraisal, is this is a woman right about to fall asleep. Mm-hmm. She's looking at her fish. She's working her ass off. She's got her little pad there. It's Christmas time. She's alone.
But again,
she's about to fall asleep, and the world is kind of fading into that sleep world. That's what I take from it.
But I mean, look at the broad brush strokes. I mean, clearly didn't care so much about detail here.
Homie had to finish the background. really quickly.
Yeah, here's another Picasso, and actually this one is quite a nice one.
This looks like a kick-ass album cover. I would buy the album if I saw this. It was just like a, some kind of homeless musician. This was his persona, Kurt Cobain-esque. I,
Yeah,
I like this. I don't think, not
yeah,
the thing that I would draw, but
yeah.
okay, you're washing a kid's feet. This is a moment that parents have.
Yeah. This one is by Mary Cassatt. She's the same thing, it's the same time period. She's the late 1800s.
It's the same thing. They did a very lazy job with the background. There's all the energies in the foreground, and it's like they were just slapping, stuff to cover the back. Like,
Here's another Paul Gauguin.
Paul me like Tahiti. Was this
Yeah,
Tahiti guy?
He did. But again, just look at the color palette. The color palette is not necessarily realistic.
He did not want this to be admissible in court. He wanted this to be fantasy enough that they wouldn't be able to charge him with anything. He got back. Okay.
Here's Jackson Pollock.
I'm not a fan. Not a fan of Jackson.
Oh, again, like I said, well, we talked about we're going to talk about Kandinsky and Picasso in the next one. We are certainly talking about Jackson Pollock.
Yeah.
Jackson Pollock plays a critical role in why art is so hideous right now, and maybe you can see why.
Yeah, that's the aftermath of like a sex show. That's not anything anyone should be putting on their wall. Who's this?
I think this is Matisse as well. Yeah, this is Matisse, who's Bathers by a River.
It looks like it was trying to be an animation, and it just stopped. It was just not going to be an animation. It was just, it's like that grape that never quite got to develop.
Yeah.
It's like that kind of thing. It's like an aborted freaking cartoon. It's what I take. It's sad. It's an incomplete thing.
Well, Matisse is really the first famous artist who the critics said he's making a point with how ugly it is. Again, he's early 1900s as well.
Okay.
Again, this is not the selection of paintings here is not me trying to find ugly stuff. Some of it was quite interesting looking.
I like some of it.
But
I'm being as fair as I can.
Yeah, I'm just trying to give you a fair cross section of the famous works of art that were visible in that in Ferris Bueller's. Here's a sculpture, but more importantly, if you look in the background, especially on the right there, those are a whole bunch of paintings by Monet, the famance impressionist. Again, he's late 1800s.
I like that this is body positive, this sculpture. It's nice to see a dad bod represented. That's good.
Here's them looking at three more Picasso paintings.
Yeah, it doesn't stare into my soul.
No.
I think it's just like because I know drug addicts and their art. It kind of like, I know, it distorts reality. It looks kind of weird. I get that it's a little novel, but it's not something you get bored with very quickly. It's
I agree
kind of
with
how
that.
to touch people that are painting reality as they kind of see it. And
No, I completely agree with that. And this is the painting that the scene culminates on. This painting is called Sunday Afternoon on the Isle of La Grande Jatte. And Ferris Bueller's nerdy friend is staring at it, and then he stares closer and sees it's a bunch of little dots. And then he stares closer, sees it's more little dots. And because it's a really pretentious scene, he keeps staring closer and closer and says, hey, this kid has no face, just like I really have no identity, because it's an 80s movie by a pretentious...
I was just talking about drugs and people on drugs interacting with these pieces, and it's just, we gotta have that common reality, guys. We gotta have that common experience, or shit becomes meaningless.
Yeah, well, but...
It's a beautiful painting.
It is. Well, and now...
Not this close.
This painting, we will come back to this painting at the end of this episode, because this painting is, again, this specific painting is important in the story of how art got where it currently is. But just the point I'm trying to make is this is the scene in a famous 80s movie that essentially introduced Generation X to art appreciation.
Okay. It's funny when it always comes back to mass media.
Yep.
At a certain time period. That's just how powerful mass media was. Like everybody saw certain movies.
Well, again, and that tells you more about art than whatever some pretentious idiot in a turtleneck is going to tell you. But the important thing is all of these paintings we looked at, all of them were either late 1800s or early 1900s.
Another one of these kind of frozen in time.
Yeah. So why is it? Why is it that of all of the art that could have been selected, this one famous museum in Chicago that John Holmes decided to be pretentious and self-indulgent about, why was all of this art from about a 50-year period?
That's an interesting question.
So again, I'm just throwing these questions out there, but this is something that we got to get to the bottom of. So.
That guy, if you guys don't know
Ben Stein.
Ben Stein, you want to talk about an interesting figure. He had some opinions at a certain point. And that would be.
He also hosted a game show in the late 90s, if you're a millennial.
Win Ben Stein's money. His whole shtick was like, he was a miserable old guy, and then when he had miserable old guy opinions, people freaked out. I don't get it.
So if a whole generation's idea of art comes from one movie in the 80s, and that movie is just one scene centered on one art gallery in Chicago, that tells us something. That tells us that art is institutional and almost specific to a culture, because whatever art is, it's not independent of the big American museums. Art history, at least as we think of it now, has to mean art that ended up in American museums. Again, I'm sure there was all sorts of famous French art over the years that just never left France. In fact, even while all this impressionist and somewhat modern art was being done, there was still art being done in France in the classical style. Probably the most famous example of that is the Thinker, the famous statue. Yeah. That was being made at the same time as all of this stuff, but the Thinker was much more of a classical statue as opposed to all of this art we just saw here.
Yeah, it's almost out of this.
Yeah, so again, what is art? We still haven't defined it, but in the 20th century, when the United States is the global hegemon, they own the definition of art. I hate to say it, they do, because this scene in this movie wouldn't define what art is if they didn't.
It wouldn't have the cultural residence.
Yeah.
Or residence. It's interesting to think of like the culture being. How the tight bottlenecks that exist in culture sometimes, and these small groups of people that get to decide, what's going to get through the filter and what's not going to get through the filter.
Yeah.
And how much that skews our view of things.
Well, it's just, all I'm saying is that we have a suspect now, because if 20th century art became ugly and the definition of 20th century art is centered on the United States, there's only one place that art could have become ugly.
Yeah.
So, sorry Americans,
Yeah,
I love you guys. You guys make great movies. You guys give the world a bunch of medical breakthroughs, but whatever happened to art happened on your soil.
Yeah.
But we're going to have to look into what that is.
And God bless you. We love, we love our American viewers. That's just, we got to lay fault where fault is due.
In our last episode, we had to jump back 500 years to the Renaissance and see where the idea of art started, even though the word wasn't used. Once again, we're going to have to jump back in history, so we're going to leave Ferris Bueller's dipshit rich friend for now, and we're going to jump back to the Georgian era, so the mid to late 1700s, because we need to talk about a man named Joshua Reynolds. This man right here. Just as Vasari became the head of a new art academy in the 1500s, and the French had opened their Academy of Fine Arts, or l'Académie des Beaux-Arts, in the 1640s, the English were a little late to the party on that one, possibly because of the English Civil War, which we'll talk about in a future episode. But in 1768, the Royal Academy was founded, and this guy was at the head of it. So what was going on in the 1760s? This is the age of Samuel Johnson and James Boswell and Edmund Burke, and if you don't know who those guys are, your education failed you.
Yeah,
Failed a lot of us, but
a lot of people got failed by public education.
So for 20 years, this group of thinkers and writers and just the finest intellectual minds of their era, they would meet at the Turk's Head Tavern in London to have a bunch of discussions. And like, don't let anybody tell you that the university is the proper forum to have intellectual discussions. That is a very 20th century thing. These are the people who wrote, treatises, not just treatises, but foundational stuff in the English tradition of thinking and in English philosophy and English political thought. And they just, a group of friends who are all probably slightly autistic, they were on the spectrum. They would meet at a pub in London once a week, and they'd get drunk and share their ideas with each other and write papers afterwards.
Yeah,
It's
all
that's
you need.
I know.
If you want to make progress.
Well, and again, just don't listen to anybody who has a credential. Say, I have a PhD from the University of Michigan on feminist tropes in Shakespeare or whatever. Bullshit. You don't need to listen to any of that stuff. That's not the way things were done for most of history.
Some of the stupidest people I've met have been on university campuses.
Yep.
And some of the smartest people I've met have been, beating up drunks in bars.
Yeah. Well, autodidacts, I'm sorry. It's somebody who's willing to spend time in the library on their own. Does it matter if they're getting a master's degree for it or not? No, it doesn't.
Well, there's some people, there's two kinds of intelligence, right? There's crystallized intelligence, which is like your knowledge base and what you know and what you've been trained on. And then there's fluid intelligence, which is your problem solving, your ability to put information together to solve issues. There's people with incredible fluid intelligence that have almost no crystal intelligence because they left school in grade 10. And the reverse is also true, and there's advantages to both, but,
but I'm still saying even the crystallized intelligence, these thinkers, including Joshua Reynolds, who we haven't talked about here, who we're about to talk about shortly, these were all people who were just very well read, and they would have their discussions at the Turk's Head Tavern, not in the faculty lounge of Oxford University.
And it's important to note that early universities were not stuffy places. These were rowdy, Animal House, crazy kids.
Well, it's also where they were training the next generation of priests, and people who believe they're making calls about what's good and evil in society. These are not usually staid people.
You're dealing with essentially a monastic order.
Yep.
And anybody who's going to be cloistered away from the opposite sex is going to have some interesting explanations for why they're doing that. Usually, some are very nice people who have, I'm sure, very good motives. Many are running from something.
Yep.
And you're going to put all the ruling class young men around them. Well, you're going to get some weird stuff going on. And it still warrants everyone to keep an eye on what's going on at elite private schools. That's something that everyone should be very mindful of and should be watching and listening for news on. Is what is the ruling class's kids learning right now? That's something that warrants some investigation.
Yeah. Oh, we'll be talking about the French Revolution very shortly as well.
Ooh, that's apropos. That's going to be great.
Now, I'm going to just go back to a question I asked in our previous episode. Imagine a dancer who's talented enough to dance lead at the ballet. That really talented dancer may or may not be an artist. Why did painting and art appreciation become an activity that some little flitty guy in a black turtleneck talks about and spends his time at cocktail parties pontificating on? Joshua Reynolds, he is one of these brilliant thinkers who hangs out with Samuel Johnson and Boswell and Gibbon, the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire guy, and Edmund Burke and Adam Smith and all these people. He hangs out with all these people at the Turk's Head Tavern every week.
Steel sharpens steel.
Yep. and he in some sense he becomes the archetype of that black turtleneck brooding pretentious artist or art critic,
Okay.
especially the British one, the pretentious British academic. That's a very specific type.
He's like the Sonny Barger.
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
This look. Okay.
Now again, Vasari, who we talked about last week, he talked about painters and sculptors as being driven by something higher than cabinet makers and Geppetto. But at the end of the day, that was an after-the-fact propaganda book meant to fanboy at Michelangelo. Go back and listen to the last episode if you're not sure what I'm talking about there.
Homie really liked Michelangelo.
Yes, he did. The late 1700s, they're a very learned age in England, and again, this Reynolds guy, he hangs out with all the greatest minds of the era, but what did he do? He was a portrait painter. And at least in those days, portrait painting was almost viewed as journeyman work.
Yeah, makes sense.
If you were good at it, you could certainly get some status, as evidenced by the number of portrait painters who became knights, like Peter Paul Rubens and Anthony van Dyck. You might notice that these are not English names; these are Dutch names.
Yeah.
But again,
you were tulips.
Well, you were a German or a Dutch technician. You were very, very good at doing art. If you went over to London to make your living doing it, you could get status in London, and some of these people became knights.
Okay.
Peter Paul Rubens, he was the first one of them to gain knighthood. Arguably, it was because he was a diplomat. He was a representative of the Dutch government. Maybe he didn't get knighthood because of his painting, but Sir Anthony van Dyck certainly did. Okay. The guy with the weird beard.
It's always unfortunate.
Yeah.
A lot of strange facial hair comes and goes in terms of style.
Yeah. Well, also another thing to remember is that this was still the age of royalty and royal courts and nobles. And if you were German, you got status by painting somebody in one of these German princes' courts. Remember, there wasn't Germany. It was like hundreds of little fiefdoms that would become Germany after Bismarck. But if you got in with one of these nobles or dukes or princes or kings, he might introduce you to his friend in London, and that's how a lot of these continental artists ended up in England.
Okay.
Again, it's another reason why also you don't have any British composers. You have people like Handel who were German who moved to Britain and became famous.
So right from the beginning, you have English people wanting art from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
In England, we talked about from the Reformation, Henry VIII, he closed down all of the monasteries, and a whole bunch of middle-class people were able to get land that wouldn't have otherwise been available to them.
Took the church to the cleaners.
Yeah. Well, but what did all of these newly landed people do? They sent their kids to Oxford, or at least they wanted to. And they would send their kids to Oxford to study philosophy or medicine or mathematics, the so-called liberal arts, as we talked about in the last episode. And at least at that point, again, this is a couple hundred years before Reynolds here, painting was just considered a trade. It was considered something dirty. And the English middle class almost gets this bias against laborers. I mean, this is something you do if you need to do it, but if you're one of the truly ambitious people, you're going to go to university and be trained in the classics and the ways of antiquity in the writings of Cicero. Even in Shakespeare, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, what is the group of actors called? They're called the rude mechanicals.
Yep.
They're the people who have to work trade jobs during the day and only have time to do their creative endeavor being actors at night.
Yep, actors are not thought of as high class for most of human history.
But again, there's certainly other cultures in the world where being good with your hands gives you some status. But you can see even from the age of Shakespeare, that language, the rude mechanicals, tells you what they think of people who work with their hands.
It's an administrative class in England that does a lot of the writing and creation of culture. Like,
Well, one of the biggest critics, or one of the most poignant critics of John Locke's liberalism, he was a guy named Josiah Tucker. Even to this day, his writings still seem relevant. They seem like a relevant criticism of the dominant modern philosophy. He says this is maybe not the smartest way to look at running society. If you're looking to run a machine, do you want a scientist who knows how to invent machines, or do you want a mechanic who knows how to fix things?
when I'm going fishing up north, I don't hire a marine biologist who specializes in freshwater species to take me fishing. I hire the best fishermen in the area to take me fishing. At the end of the day, I want, a mechanic, not a freaking engineer.
Yeah.
When you're talking about actually going out and doing something. So, and it's two different sets of skills.
Yep, both important.
Very important. When the power starts going out, you guys are going to see how important those skills are.
So, going back to the Georgian era, the time of Reynolds, one of the educated Oxford men, the Earl of Shaftesbury, he writes a treatise on aesthetics. And he says that portrait painting is not a liberal art. It's not something to be esteemed. It requires no liberal knowledge, genius, education, manners, morals, mathematics, optics. It's something practical and vulgar.
Okay, Jesus.
Now again, this is, if I hire an interior decorator these days, this person can be very talented, but you think of it as some rich guy's wife who just wants to have a hobby. You don't think of her as being a true
artisan,
intelligent, stalwart of 21st century culture. And I guess portrait painters were thought of as the same way. It was a trade.
Yeah,
it was
what you did.
Something messy that you did with your hands.
A photographer.
The Earl of Shaftesbury, what he was talking about, it's the attitude that gave us Peter Paul Rubens. The Dutch masters, they were just hired by rich people in Amsterdam or in London to give them a family portrait to hang in their house. Artistry or portrait making didn't have to be viewed as something high class in order to give us some of the greatest portrait painters of all time. And to be completely honest, I would be perfectly fine with us going back to this opinion of portrait painters, because it would immediately get rid of all these dipshit conceptual artists who say, I took a shit on the ground and this tells us about the suffering of the black community. Like, fuck that. If painting were viewed as a respectable trade again, what would these concept artists do?
Imagine you had to go to trade school.
Yeah.
Imagine you had to go right next to the plumbers and the freaking, the carpenter kids.
Yeah. So, Joshua Reynolds, he was on a mission to prove that painting was not just a trade. It was a legitimate liberal art. It was something that required some sort of higher level academic thought. And if you want to be completely frank, this is where our idea of art comes from. It's what this guy's idea of art is.
Jesus.
One guy.
One of the troubling things about researching history is you sometimes find, my whole concept of this came out of one dude.
Yep.
Who wrote a book. Like I mentioned to you, I like to go fishing. I'm Canadian. I had all these rules passed down from my dad and grandfather, who I used to fish with, about fairness, not putting the importance of catch and release, the importance of being good to the environment, using only one hook, never snagging a fish. The fish had to bite the hook or it wasn't fair. All these rules that I thought were just universal fishing rules. And it turned out it all goes back to this book, The Complete Angler.
Yep.
Where this guy, and it all was there, and I was just like, wow, this was handed down generation to generation to me.
Yeah, that book was like the 1600s, I think.
But I didn't even realize I had this weird, cult. Yeah, I was part of this very strange culture that saw fishing this way.
Yep.
Most places, you're just getting the fish out of the water. That's most cultures. You're just getting food. But I had this almost mystical, spiritual relationship with fishing because of this guy who wrote a book.
Yep.
hundreds of years ago.
Well, again, we see our concept of art. I'm just going to say it right now. It's a British idea.
Yep.
I mean, not to say there weren't great artists in other cultures, but without this one guy in England in the Georgian age, they would have still just been painters and sculptors and etchers and engravers and architects and whatever. The idea of capital A artists, that's an idea that this guy essentially makes up. And especially post-Napoleon, you have the century of British dominance, especially during the Victorian age. And when Britain has a century of world hegemony, the British idea of art kind of becomes the dominant idea of art.
It makes sense. Yeah, they inherited the world, and a lot of their ideas and way of doing things was just handed down.
Yep.
That's why everybody loves cricket.
Yeah. Especially in certain parts of the world.
Oh, dude, lots of cricket in India. I love watching my father-in-law enjoy cricket. It's just, to me, I don't know the rules. I don't understand the sport at all. But he gets so excited. It's so nice to see him just lost it.
I know that they stop for tea halfway through it. That's about all I know about cricket.
Yeah, very British sport. Something about wickets. I don't know.
So, again, what kind of an artist was Reynolds? Like I said, he was a very successful portrait painter. Here we see portraits done by Joshua Reynolds of two of the famous playwrights of his day. One is David Garrick. He was an actor as well as a playwright. And the one on the right is Oliver Goldsmith. No, he's not Jewish with a name like that.
Wow.
Well, it just didn't. Goldsmith means somebody who works with his hands with gold. It wasn't gold trader. It wasn't.
Okay. It wasn't Goldberg.
No.
Not the German.
Goldsmith was disfigured by having smallpox early on in his life, but Reynolds was able to do a painting of him that actually looks quite respectable. So that's kind of what he had a talent for making people look good, if not necessarily realistic. But
it's the advantage of painting over photography.
Yep, that it is. Again, it's what he did. He was a portrait painter, and he had a studio. But in 1768. When King George III becomes the patron and founds the Royal Academy, he puts Reynolds in charge of it. And Reynolds writes a book called Discourses on Art, which is meant to be discussed in high society. And is it pretentious? Yes, it's pretentious. But you'll notice the language used there, Discourses on Art. As far as I know, this is the first instance of art, the word art, really being used to describe the act of painting and the act of sculpture as a liberal art, as something that should be discussed in the academy.
Okay, interesting.
Maybe he was doing this to promote himself. Maybe he had selfish reasons for it. Again, he was a smart guy. He was part of the club of the greatest thinkers of his era, meeting at the Turk's Head Tavern. But he writes this book, Discourses on Art, which, in much the same way that Vasari's Lives of the Artists becomes the first work of what we now call art history, Discourses on Art is another one of these seminal works that are not just a record of the famous painters and sculptors of the day. They almost define our concept of what art is.
Okay.
He talks about the importance of reading great books and talking to learned men, and he even, in one lecture, he talks about the theory of art. Again, this is where the word comes from in the first place. It comes from this guy.
Okay.
Even in Reynolds' own day, though, people thought this guy was pretentious. One of his students was William Blake. You might know him more as a poet. This is one of his illustrated poems. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills, and was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land.
Oh.
Now,
Seems like you're asking for trouble.
for those of you keeners who have been listening to our whole podcast, our whole 15 or 16 episodes up to this point, what is something we keep bringing up? We keep bringing up the Puritans, and they keep talking about New Jerusalem.
Yep.
This is one of William Blake's most famous poems, and the man is a Puritan.
And if you grew up in church, you probably sang this.
Yep.
So
You'll notice something, though, that in other contexts, the idea of New Jerusalem, like when it was when Calvinism came into Scotland, they tore down all the old Catholic churches and said New Jerusalem's going to arise from this. This poem was written a little bit later on when the Industrial Revolution was starting. But now this is almost the opposite. We're going to tear down these satanic mills, these supposed symbols of progress, and we are going to return England to its pristine state, and that will be New Jerusalem.
So Lord of the Rings, basically?
Well, I'm saying these two concepts of New Jerusalem, they very much tell us the difference between the American outlook on the world and the English outlook on the world. But that's not just a story for another day. That's something we've already spoken about in some of our other episodes, but this is one of our ongoing motifs that we're going to keep coming back to, but this is not an episode about that. This is an episode about art history. Now, my esteemed colleague, my co-host here, he's not the only one who worked security. When I was going back to school, I had a bit of a weekend job working bar mitzvahs a couple of weekends. And on one of these occasions, a dancer shows up with a male dancer shows up with a poem tattooed on his side, like on the side of his rib cage. And I'm just trying to make small talk with the guy. I'm like, oh, what's that painting, or what's that poem? And he says, oh, it's Shakespeare. Oh, what play? Oh, I just love Shakespeare so much that like
the beautiful dodge.
Okay, like, all right, you got, if I was going to get a poem on my midsection, I would at least want to know what work it came from.
Yeah, typically, if you're going to brand yourself with something, you want to at least know the context it was written in.
So
what if it was from Mein Kampf?
Yeah.
What?
I whip up my phone, and I'm just curious to see what this work is. It's about love and deceit, and it's not a poem by Shakespeare, it's a poem by William Blake. If you want to know what kind of people become dancers.
So basically, the guys who run the majority of bar mitzvahs, I'm not going to say the name, but they want a never-ending supply of like young dancers, so they promote a lot of like dancing competitions and things in like Scarborough.
Yep.
And so
this was a white guy.
Oh no, some of them are white people in Scarborough, but a lot of these kids come up through that kind of program. They like, ghetto kids that are like, this is their opportunity to make like $200 a night. Yeah. So,
you don't have to actually be familiar with Shakespeare. You just have to know that rich people like it. Yep. And most rich people don't have the actual interest in this stuff that I do. No, they just want to feel smart.
Yeah, not detail oriented by and large.
Anyways, just about William Blake, though. As a young man, he was one of Reynolds' early students at the Royal Academy. He's probably more well known as a poet, but he was also a painter as well, and an engraver too. And he just thinks Reynolds is full of shit with his theories of art.
That's why debate's important.
Part of it is that Reynolds, in his books, he talks about, Plato and universality in one breath. Then he talks about John Locke in the next breath. And if you know anything about political philosophy, these two are very, very difficult to reconcile with each other. And Reynolds talks about it like it should be obvious.
Jesus Christ.
Again, the pretentious academic who likes to use a lot of academic jargon, Reynolds is the archetypical version of that. And another thing that Blake really doesn't like is that Reynolds talks about how oil painting is on the same level of philosophy, but he looks down on engraving as being something vulgar, and Blake is really quite good at engraving.
Ah, the truth comes out.
So again,
sorry, engravers.
Bitchy creative shit. It happened in Italy during the Renaissance. It happens in England in the Georgian era.
Creatives do not get along by and large.
Yeah.
It's like Siamese fighting fish. You get two celebrities together, there's a tension. I've noticed. Even if they're friendly, they seem to know each other. There seems to be that that little bit of we would destroy each other given the opportunity.
So now we fast forward a few years, even a few decades actually. I mean, the idea of the Royal Academy is no longer something novel. Reynolds has passed away, it's been around for a few generations, and we move into the early 1800s, which is the Romantic era. Now, again, we've already established where the concept of art comes from. It's very explicitly associated with the Royal Academy in England. So as we move into the Romantic era, what's the world like at this time? Well, England is known as a nation of shopkeepers, and this is more generally the start of the Industrial Revolution. Remember, the Royal Academy was founded in 1768. James Watt, he introduced the steam engine in 1765. So that's the timeline we're thinking about here.
Okay.
So this is when society is really starting to transition from the merchant-based mercantile society to capitalism, where the factory owners are the ones who have all the wealth and, by extension, all the power in society. And art, whether you call it art or whether you retroactively apply that term, it's certainly changing. Whereas painters, they had previously exclusively needed to hobnob with royalty and nobility. Now they're starting to become a little bit more of a middle class. There's starting to become more of a market for art, and not if you want to be a painter, you don't just have to impress the king or impress the church. There's other creative avenues for you to go.
There's a consumer base now for this art.
There will become more of a consumer base as the years go on. But art is kind of moving from just the royal courts and the church into these academies and into the exhibitions and the shows of these academies. So you want to join the academy, you want to get your art in one of these art shows, and you're hoping that somebody rich in England or in France, if you happen to be there, is interested in your work and willing to buy it.
Okay.
And this is going to have a huge, profound change on the art world.
This is a new way art's being financed, basically.
Not just a new way in art's being financed, but almost a new way that art is being consumed.
Okay. Through the academies, basically?
Through the academies, and art is possibly going to be hanging in somebody's private, country manor, as opposed to being hanging in a church or hanging in a castle.
Okay.
If you go to a museum in England which hasn't been completely vandalized by postmodern shit, which unfortunately is becoming more and more of them, you'll see probably the collection of some rich guy who collected a whole bunch of art over the course of his life, and when he died, he donated it to a museum to become the centerpiece of their collection. And this is the kind of art we're about to look at. But just remember that because this is the kind of art that is actually bought by the rich, now we have to be concerned with what's the taste of society in general, as opposed to what the church or the nobility wants.
So what does the middle class want?
Yeah, well, now we spoke about this in a previous episode, the rise of Britain after the fall of Napoleon, and we talked about how you have a large generation, because England was the first country to solve infant mortality. So you have a huge generation being born. We have an empire that needs administrators, so they all want to send their kids to university so that they can go work at the colonial office in Singapore or Hong Kong or Bombay or Nairobi or Toronto or Kingston, Jamaica, or somewhere. So they all want to send their kids to Oxford or Cambridge, where they can get a classical education to become the face of England at one of the outposts of the empire.
Oh,
and make their money that way.
When education opened doors.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And this is why the Victorian era, and I guess it's not quite the Victorian era, we're still in the Romantic era, but this is a learned age. This is an age where you get status by being an intellectual.
Not now.
Now it's completely the opposite. If you want to be the person who wants to study art for its own sake, you're going to be told, this is colonial and patriarchal and outdated, pale, male, and stale. No, this is...
Or you just get weird looks. It's just a weird hobby,
Yep. So, what is the Romantic era? Well, the Romantic era is the first few decades of the 1800s. Now, Romanticism is kind of hard to define in general, because different countries have a different... They go through very different things in the Romantic era. Like in Germany, Romanticism comes out of Sturm und Drang. It's very much an anti-Enlightenment movement. We don't like these ideas that talk about the common man having power. The Germans don't like that. The Germans quite want the opposite of that.
That'll set the stage for the rest of the.
Yeah. Now, England never really had an Enlightenment, and part of this is because they saw what happened in France.
Yeah.
And they said, maybe we need to have reforms like every other society does, but let's not kill the whole aristocracy and then start cutting off each other's heads.
Yeah, let's do this reasonably.
So there really is no true English Enlightenment, but nothing exists in a vacuum, and a lot of these Enlightenment ideas still do waft in on their own. And that's kind of what the Romantic era is in England. It's where a lot of these Enlightenment ideas in individuals, some of them come in, some of them don't. And the English intelligentsia, they need to grapple with, whether we want to accept these ideas or do we not want to accept these ideas.
Seeing France go crazy
Yeah.
probably help.
Yeah. It certainly had a large individualistic streak that came from the Enlightenment, but it definitely had some counter-Enlightenment ideas as well. For example, respect for nature and celebrate heroism. These are two ideas that are not really part of the hyper-individualistic Enlightenment that swept France. The learned people in England decide that this is what we want what we want to have is kind of a bulwark against these ideas coming in, and these are two ideas that we're going to start seeing in some of the art that exists in this period. The two biggest anti-Enlightenment ideas, though, that characterize England: nationalism and reverence for beauty, in and of itself.
Wow.
Well, clearly that's a response to industrialization. Like, there were certainly people who thought that, okay, all these factories are being built and they're going to bring all sorts of wealth in. This is a time to turn the page on our old superstitious antiquated ideas and look towards the future. The English intellectual class, they said, nope, we're not going to do that. We're going to still, we're still going to have our industrial revolution. We're still going to modernize. We're still going to look toward the future, but we're going to make sure we're keeping some of the old ideas. And one of these ideas is reverence for beauty. Take notes, Americans.
Yeah.
We're not going to get to that till the next episode. But just as the 20th century seems to view ugliness as something intelligent in and of itself, the 19th century, at least as far as England goes, it's the complete opposite, is we want beauty in and of itself. It seems like something so obvious, but I have huge respect for the British Empire and the glorious history that essentially spawned Canada and spawned Australia and spawned civilization in most of the world. And that's maybe that's just why it seems obvious to me that art should be beautiful and art should be centered on beauty. But again, this is not something universal. This is not something timeless. This is very much a 19th century idea. Another thing about the Romantic era, it's not really possible to trace any modern political theory, at least in the English-speaking world, in the Anglosphere. It's not really possible to trace it back any farther than this point, because you see ideas that become progressive ideas, you see ideas that become conservative ideas, but they kind of live side by side here. You have people like Shelley and Byron who are totally radical. But you also have people like Jane Austen and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who are very much what we now call conservative, people who just want to write about merry old England and people being content with life in the countryside. There's not really any animus between these two outlooks on the world. They're just two sides of the Romantic era.
Okay.
So, we mentioned William Blake earlier. His poem is still on the screen here. We mentioned how he would roll his eyes at Joshua Reynolds when he was a student. Again, it's not going to surprise you that he was a Puritan.
Oh, here we go.
Like I said, England is starting to industrialize, and he's talking about these satanic mills, and again, he's talking about New Jerusalem. Another thing that you might not notice, where he talks about things like chariots of fire, this is language directly from the King James Bible.
Yeah.
What do Puritans believe? They believe just give us the Bible and give us a bare bones church and we'll worship on our own. There's a lot buried in this poem right here. It doesn't just represent the Romantic era, it represents the Puritan tradition as well.
I like that the Puritans were against industrializing.
The Puritans in England were. New England is a little different.
Yeah.
But again, he's a Puritan talking about New Jerusalem, so what is something we've talked about in our other episodes? He's clearly a progressive.
Yeah, exactly. He wants to build.
Yeah, he wants
some
to...
kind of paradise.
Yeah. But he's a Puritan, he's progressive, he talks about New Jerusalem. There's also a conservative streak in this poem as well, and this is what I mean about the Romantic era. Again, just talking about going back to a simpler time in England, not just looking towards the future, looking backwards as well. When I talk about the Romantic era being not quite progressive, not quite radical, not quite conservative, just romantic, it's all on display if you just read this poem. 4 stanzas of this poem. You have all of the different ideologies that have unfortunately become, battle lines that have people at each other's throat in the modern era in the 21st century. They're almost all, you can see them all right here in this one poem, and they're not at odds with each other.
Humans are gonna fight. That's just humans like a good fight.
Well, I'm sure that people, in fact, I know people were arguing with each other about different things back at this time. I'm just saying the ideological battle lines we have now, they were clearly not there when this poem was written.
Yeah. Well, and how many people nowadays realize the roots of the ideological struggle that they've been kind of globbed into?
Yep.
Like, it's sad. It's, you die, you're, fighting a dead war.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Or worse, you're fighting a battle that was lost 50 years ago.
Yep.
Now, another figure that sums up the Romantic era, just things you would. I don't want to be pretentious and say paradox, but again, somebody who represents both what we now think of as progressivism and conservatism is William Wordsworth. This is a guy who was a radical in his youth. He went to Paris. He apparently had some bastard children with his muse there.
Yep.
These weren't known about until after he was dead, but
Bernie Sanders did the same thing.
all right. Yeah, so Wordsworth, when he's in Paris when things get a little bit heated, shall we say, and he barely escaped with his head.
When they were going to build a world built on equality and reason.
On reason, yeah. So things get a little too real for him. He escapes back to England, and does he become a radical in England? No, he just moves out to the countryside, spends the rest of his days writing poetry in this quiet English country estate with his loyal wife. Just as in his youth he was in Paris with a French whore who was giving him illegitimate children. Apparently his muse later in life is just this perfect Proverbs Anglican wife.
So he became Samwise Gamgee.
Well, but again, from the modern point of view, it's easy to say, okay, he was radical in his youth and conservative when he was older. But it's a time in history when these two things were not, they hadn't branched out yet and gotten at loggerheads yet.
Yet to diverge.
Yeah.
As the biologists might say.
Yeah. So I just want to say that we're going to start looking at the art of the Romantic period, and I'm just saying don't think of it through any sort of a modern lens of is this progressive, is it conservative, because all of these ideas, they're all there in the Romantic era, and they're just they live side by side at peace. They're not trying to crowd each other out yet.
This is the Garden of Eden of this stuff.
Yeah. Again, like I said, there are certainly other arguments going on, just not that one. So one of the things you start to see in this period, especially now that there is an established Royal Academy, is you start to really see the idea of art for the sake of art. You're doing it for the Academy in and of itself.
Okay.
And the two British painters who really personify the era, they're two men named Constable and Turner. And if you've taken an art history class, these are the two men who are spoken about when you talk about the early 19th century. You don't hear about any British artists before then. You don't really hear about any British artists after this period either. So it's another piece of the puzzle of the story of art that ends up with some spoiled Toronto Asian girl hanging exposed film from the roof. Is just the question is, why does the story of art only go back to England for a very brief period during the Romantic era? Why do we only care about Constable and Turner in the overarching story of art? And why do we not care about any other English artists? And then why do we care about so many French artists later on?
Yeah, that's interesting.
We're gonna get to that.
Oh.
But these two guys, Constable and Turner, they're both landscape painters. Makes sense because Romanticism really focuses on nature and beauty, so it kind of makes sense that the landscape painting becomes a mode of art in this period. Think about it. The German prince who wanted Mozart to come in and play piano in his court. Can you think of that? can you imagine that print saying, "Hey, can you paint me a landscape painting?" It just didn't happen back
Yeah,
then.
that does make sense.
That is something that comes out of the Romantic era.
Ah.
And so let's take a look at Constable and Turner. First of all,
Oh
this is
wow,
Constable.
that's the one on the bottom right, especially.
Yeah,
It's like vivid.
yeah. Again, we in the modern era, we would almost think of this as something being on a postcard.
Yeah.
But in the early 1800s, this is, if you saw this in the year 1810, this is something new and revolutionary. This was like watching Die Hard in the theaters in the late 80s. It's like you'd been blown away. There was never a movie like that before then.
This is like freaking Nirvana coming in.
Yeah, kind of. This is not just original. This captures the zeitgeist. It's not just a guy coming up with some new idea because he wants to be different. This kind of captures the reverence for nature and reverence for beauty that runs through British intellectual thought at the time.
Yeah, they can see the Shire.
Yeah, exactly.
The eventual Shire coming from these roots.
But while you have Die Hard, which captured the imagination by perfecting the 80s action genre, that's what Constable was. You also have the yin to the yang. You've got a guy like Quentin Tarantino who goes very stylized and decides to break all the rules, and that's his contemporary Turner.
These are awesome.
It's beautiful as well. I'm just saying it's a very different kind of art. It's
Yeah.
not realistic. It gets the point across by saying, it doesn't need to look the way nature looks to really give you the feeling of staring at a big open field or staring at a seascape.
A storm coming in. Or
Yeah. Yeah. When I was in London about 10 years ago, I went to the Tate Gallery where they have the Turner Gallery, where they have the Turner collection, and you hear about being sucked into a painting. I thought that was just something that pretentious art critics talked about. No, you are standing in front of these paintings, you feel like you get sucked in, and you feel like you're standing on the coastline watching the storm. I don't know how else to describe it. So just like, when you watched Pulp Fiction for the first time, you weren't really sure what you were watching. You just knew it was something different,
Yeah.
and it kind of changed the whole genre. That's what Turner was.
Groundbreaking. You
Yeah.
okay? No. I'm pretty fucking far from okay.
Yeah. Yep, that's what this guy was. Yeah, he was able to look at a landscape and say, okay, it doesn't need to be photorealistic. I'm going to go back to my studio and just paint the idea that I got from looking at it. A lot of people don't like his paintings because they think it's drab, and he uses a lot of grays and a lot of depressing colors. But go to England and tell me that the landscape doesn't look depressing there. It's beautiful. It's just never stops raining.
Yeah, same with
Yeah.
BC.
Yeah.
Same kind of complaint.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the UK, I love Britain, but you don't go there for the food and you don't go there for the weather.
No.
Now,
When I was over there for my honeymoon, we were just like consistently getting Mexican food.
yeah,
Does not speak well of the local cuisine. Although I did get English breakfast. That I liked.
going back to Constable and Turner. Once again, more bitchy artist shit. These two did not like each other very much. And one exhibition in 1831, their works are supposed to be side by side, but Constable kind of pulls some strings and arranges to have Turner's work moved to a less prominent place in the back room.
Creatives do not get along.
So a year later, they're supposed to be displayed side by side again, and back in this era, the academies and the exhibitions, they would have something called Varnishing Day, where before, a couple days before the public got to see all the art, you got to go in and make any finishing touches, including like putting varnish on it to make sure that the colors are extra vibrant. And Turner, remembering Constable's little stunt the last year, he takes a look at Constable's painting. Constable makes the painting look extra bright. Turner stares at it, walks over to his own painting, puts a big red dot in the middle of the painting.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
See that?
Fucking asshole.
See that red dot in the middle of it? Now remember, Constable's the realistic guy. Turner is the one who just does things in a minimalistic way to get the point across. So he just puts one bright red dot in the middle of his canvas and says that's supposed to be a buoy.
Jesus Christ.
And all the critics in England's high society, they see this, they see there's a big red dot in the middle of, oh, geez, that really catches my eye. This painting is brilliant. So these two painters, they do not like each other. Constable is the realistic one. Turner is the more, conceptual one. But, even between these two, it's just a bunch of bitchy artist shit.
Yeah, some things never change.
Yeah. Drama. Yeah, the critics talk about how Turner just is so great at communicating through his minimalism. So, later on, we're going to be talking about Impressionists and Expressionists, but just realize that later on when we talk about, wide brush strokes and things that are not completely realistic, this is not something that the French made up after the Franco-Prussian War. This is something that very much comes out of this period in England.
Okay. Interesting.
But as I've said, I think I might have said this in the previous episode. I can't remember if I said it in this episode or not. The world of art is not just about the painters and the sculptors. It's a delicate ecosystem of patrons and dealers and critics and curators and gallery owners. And we can't really talk about Constable and Turner and later on Victorian art without mentioning one of the most famous critics of the day, and his name is John Ruskin. He's like a philosopher and a writer and a critic. And just like how Vasari, he was a man of the Renaissance who said that Renaissance art has surpassed antiquity. This is a truly learned age where everything creative up till now, all the Gothic architecture and all the Gothic art, that's garbage. Everything now is the true art. Ruskin kind of does the same thing. He says that this new media, or this new mode of art, the landscape painting, it has surpassed everything, including the Renaissance, because of its quote-unquote truth to nature. Again, that's the Romantic era. It's just the dominant idea of the time. And just as Vasari wrote a book about the lives of painters, Ruskin, he wrote a 5-volume work called Modern Painters. And just as Vasari was a fanboy of the aging Michelangelo, Ruskin is a fanboy of Turner.
Okay.
So Ruskin, he becomes famous as a critic, and then Turner, when he dies in 1851, people look to Ruskin to decide, okay, now that Turner, your favorite artist, has passed away, what's going to be the next big thing in English art? And then, just as now, the real artists are the ones who get anointed by the critics.
Oh, okay.
I still believe in some objective standard of beauty, which, is not some banana taped to the wall of an art gallery. At least during this age, even if it's the critics are saying what's going to be the real art and what isn't going to be the real art, at least they have standards of beauty, which I would agree with.
Yeah.
And Ruskin, he essentially single-handedly anoints the next big art movement in British art, and they're called the Pre-Raphaelites.
Ophelia?
That is.
Hey, look at me.
Hey, good for you. What are the Pre-Raphaelites? These are people who want to do things realistically over anything else. Just an autistic devotion to realism and an autistic devotion to detail.
This is almost a picture.
Yeah, exactly. But It's not just almost a picture. If you read the text of Hamlet, he mentions a bunch of flowers as she's drowning in the river. He goes out of his way. The artist I can't remember which artist did this, but the artist goes out of his way to make sure every single one of these flowers is present in this picture.
Yeah, that is a Rain Man attention to detail.
Yeah, but that's what the Pre-Raphaelites were. Um, you know, in fact, even the name Pre-Raphaelite, they wanted to emulate the first batch of artists in the Renaissance, and we talked about them in the last episode. We talked about people like Donatello, who made the really realistic sculptures, or at least sculptures unlike anything people would have seen up till that point. He did the sculpture of Mary Magdalene, who kind of looks like a crack addict, but she was a prostitute.
Yeah, that's what I took from it.
The other thing about the Pre-Raphaelites is that they explicitly reject the idea of Joshua Reynolds. They say all this bullshit about Plato and John Locke. Forget that shit. We're just going to make art as accurate as possible. Nature über alles. And this undoubtedly it comes from the conservatism of the Victorian era. Like I said before, there was a huge generation of babies being born because the English were the first ones to solve infant mortality. And when this generation is born, what's the first thing they see? They see France just go completely crazy. So they're like, yeah, we don't want anything to do with that. So there's a huge conservative generation that essentially kicks off the Victorian era. And kind of this realistic, beautiful art above all else, I think that's very much a reflection of this generation that happens. Just like Vasari said, all art up to this point is garbage. That's basically what every art manifesto is. From the Renaissance to the early modern era to the 20th century, every art manifesto is some crazy person saying, yeah, everything up to this point is garbage, but now we figured it out. Now we're entering a golden age.
We built Jerusalem.
The manifesto of the Pre-Raphaelites essentially is 4 points. They say we're going to express genuine ideas, we're going to study nature to know how to express it, we're going to go for sympathy over convention, and we're going to produce good art. That last one is something that has been lost in the modern era, but again, art is not something that's universal. Art is something that's really tied into a culture, and in this case, tied into the Royal Academy. And like I said, this is the painting of Ophelia here. It's John Everett Malais's. It can be a little bit jarring and a little bit uncanny to see it because it's still a painting, but it's realistic. It's kind of in that uncanny valley area. If you want to paint a scene from literature, in this case a scene from Shakespeare, up until this point, you would have never wanted it to look like a realistic woman drowning in a river.
Yeah,
but
make it a little stylistic.
But that's what they wanted to do in this time. That was the zeitgeist.
If you can keep your autistic kids away from Sonic the Hedgehog, these are the possibilities, people. You just don't let them get obsessed with Sonic.
So here's another Pre-Raphaelite painting.
Oh wow!
Yeah. This is by a guy named William Dice.
In Jerusalem, or the Dead Sea.
It's not Jerusalem. This is in England, but first of all, it's watercolor and it's just heightened realism. The level of realism. Here's the level of realism. You might have to squint to see it on the screen, but you see in the top of it, there's a bit of a comet. That was there. He painted it in a year there was a comet in the sky.
That's awesome.
So he had to have every realistic detail in it, and that's what he did. This painting was done just before photography kind of came into its own. Again, we take it for granted that you could just take a picture of a coastline, but this in the 1850s, this was something new.
Okay.
Now, again, it's gorgeous, but there is something just a little uncanny about it, especially if you look at the people in the foreground. There's just something kind of Monty Python about it. It almost looks like a collage or something.
Something not right. Doesn't quite meet the eye here.
Yeah. Now, so this is a coastline in England, but it's supposedly where St. Augustine landed when he brought Christianity to England. So there is supposed to be a bit of a religious undertone here, and I guess you said the Dead Sea. But more than anything else, it's just supposed to be really realistic. And maybe that comment is a biblical reference too. I'm not actually sure.
The power of autism.
I just need to get the idea across of just how specifically British this is. You would not find paintings that look like this anywhere else in the world, any other time in the world. This really realistic painting, this is something from Britain in the mid-1800s. Again, I just go back to the question I asked earlier. Why is it that we started seeing a bunch of French artists, at least on the famous artists list, in the last quarter of the 1800s? Why did it go from this to the Impressionists?
That's a very good question.
Here are a couple other paintings from the pre-Raphaelite era. The one in the top left, I think this is Venus, and I had to put a little circle over one of her body parts to make sure that YouTube doesn't. I'm sure YouTube is fine with most most artistic nudes. Autistic nudes are something different these days. But I almost worry that painting of Aphrodite is a little too realistic. It's going to catch certain 100%. YouTube filters.
Yep.
The one in the top right, that's a painting of the death of King Arthur.
Oh, okay.
Again, just like the death of Ophelia was overly realistic and might have been a little bit upsetting.
It's realistic.
It's not. It just hit you in the face with what nature is, what reality is, and death is part of nature.
Yep. No getting around that, folks.
The painting in the bottom left, that's supposed to be Mary, Joseph, Jesus, and his siblings. That certainly stirred up some controversies for a lot of reasons.
I can believe that. It's going to be the...
Not least because if you're painting Jesus and Mary and Joseph, you're supposed to make them look saintly, and in Renaissance art they'd always have a halo or a light around them. Here they just look like any other people in England. And the one in the bottom right, if you think about one of those big Renaissance paintings with all of the different people in it, this was supposed to be the pre-Raphaelite version of that.
Okay.
Whole bunch of people in a tableau, but looking like realistic English people going to the beach in the 1860s.
Yeah, it's an amazing painting. Must have taken a lot of talent to do.
So, moving forward, a couple of things define the 1870s. And we actually mentioned both of them in our banking episode of all things. The first is that there is a worldwide depression sparked by the Vienna Stock Exchange collapsing, and then an American bank failure after a railroad bankruptcy, and that leads to a collapse in the price of silver, and this just causes all sorts of economic havoc around the world, as far away as Japan. They call it. The 1870s was called the Great Depression before the 1930s was, and they called it the first truly global economic crisis.
Jeez.
One of the things that happens in the 1870s is that people become a lot more jaded about how the world works, and another thing that happens is because the middle class is now feeling squeezed, there's a lot less of an appetite for experimental art.
Yeah. Well, some stupid money flowing around.
Yeah.
So.
That's the first thing that we mentioned during the banking episode was the first Great Depression. The second thing, the Franco-Prussian War that happens in 1870. And we'll be talking about that when we look at the French artists, but one thing that happens is it causes people like Monet to come to London to flee because he doesn't want to get conscripted into the war. And you kind of have two very different styles of art that rich people in England still want to buy. First of all, you have the one on the left, which is called the aesthetic movement. This is kind of more like the Impressionists, again, less realistic, the broad brush strokes. This is championed by people like Oscar Wilde.
Oh, Oscar.
Yeah. He was a creative guy.
We got to do a podcast on Oscar Wilde at some point. Like it's a very interesting story, the kind of life he lived, the choices he made. He didn't break a lot of stereotypes. I often wonder if maybe Oscar wasn't where a lot of the modern day stereotypes kind of came from.
Yep.
In terms of the upper class gays, but
yeah. But again, so the aesthetic movement, it's another example of art for art's sake, which I was talking about with Constable and Turner. And it is somewhat escapist.
Yeah, this is not a realistic scene.
Yeah. And the other is the one you see on the right. It's the classical revival. It's the
Roman stuff.
Well, the rich people who, you made your money as a merchant selling something to the colonies or importing something. You want to have a bunch of big old Roman paintings in your mansion, knock yourself out. So that kind of comes back into style in the late 1800s. Yeah. And again, if you go to a museum or an art gallery in England, you'll probably see a surprising number of these paintings because somebody made a whole bunch of money, bought a bunch of paintings, died, and donated his collection. And these paintings are gorgeous to look at. They're murals. They take up the whole wall.
Vibrant.
But again, this is not the Renaissance where the church wanted this stuff built. This is bourgeois. This is rich people, entrepreneurs who wanted this stuff. This is the taste of the era.
Okay.
Why is it that when you look at the story of art history, again, you think of Constable and Turner, then you think of the Impressionists, then you think of the Cubists and Picasso, then you think of shit going off the rails in the 20th century. You don't see this kind of art really in the overarching story of things. And again, part of the reason is because it starts becoming a little more mass-produced.
Okay.
This art is beautiful to look at, but like I was saying earlier, art is viewed as an intellectual and a liberal art, something that the educated people are supposed to discuss. This is just something that a rich person wants to put in his house.
Yeah.
Finally, we have the Edwardian era, where Victorian styles are starting to fade away. You have the Edwardian era, which is a little more whimsical. In our last episode, we looked at Casa Loma in Toronto, which is the castle in the middle of the city that a rich guy built and then couldn't afford the upkeep on because Canada.
Yep.
This is the kind of art that you see in the place, and that Casa Loma was built in the 1910s, and this is the kind of art that would have been considered modern and contemporary back then. The Casa Loma is full of this kind of stuff. And then, of course, you have World War I, where people have a very different outlook on the world.
I just like seeing women fishing.
Yeah.
That's just always cool.
Yeah.
And this looks like, it's the kind of thing I would have done as a kid. It's like a nice day by a body of water,
Yeah. So we've reached a bit of a dead end, though. Why? Because remember Ferris Bueller, remember all of those artists that he was looking at in the art gallery in Chicago. They were all between about the 1870s and the 1940s-ish.
Okay.
Well, this art that you're looking at right here, that's smack dab in the middle of that era, but that doesn't look like any of the quote-unquote modern art that you saw in Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Yeah.
This is a very different artistic style. And again, the British Empire was still the world hegemon in the early 1910s. So where did this art go? Why is this art not part of the story of art?
That's a great question.
Well,
What the hell happened to it?
so we have a concept of modern art. When I say quote unquote modern art, I don't mean completely contemporary art. I mean stuff from the late 1800s that ends up in a corny 80s movie. Whatever that is, whether you like that art or whether you don't like that art, that is what carries on into the 20th century. This art doesn't. This art hits a dead end. If you know who made this art, great, you're maybe cultured, but you're never going to be asked what it is on Jeopardy.
Yeah, never going to be, in the movie.
If we've hit the dead end here, we have to look somewhere else. Now, most of the artists in Ferris Bueller, they were not American artists. A couple of them were, like Mary Cassatt was, Hopper was. Most of the artists, they were continental. Most were French.
Oh, okay.
So, if looking at British art doesn't bring us into the modern era, let's take a look at what's happening in France. Since the conversation was running a little bit long, we decided to cut it in half here and release it as two separate episodes. Our next episode of Radio Free History will pick up right where this one left off.
All right, you know the drill. Like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Support us at kofi.com/Radio Free History or at subscribestar.com/radio-free-history.